Okay, so I'm gonna tell you the story of how I started making this racing game. Um, First thing I did, one day I was just gonna do a tutorial on how to move an object with physics with a rigid body by applying a force to it. And here I just kind of made a ground platform and a cube with a rigid body. And then, you know, if I push forward, it applies a forward force, and then it just turns by pressing the left and the right. And when it was moving around, I felt like, hey, you know what? This movement pretty naturally feels like a car. Like imagine I'm drifting around a corner and it's like without even doing much but just letting the natural physics happen for something. And that's when I started getting the idea of making a racing game. So I took a look here with this cube. It just had I just added a trail renderer. That's so you see that blue line behind it. And that's just so I could see the motion. And I added a script here for controlling that cube by using a rigid body in physics. So here's some public variables for the acceleration of the cube and the turn speed of the cube. And then I have a private variable for the rigid body. So I can hold a pointer to this rigid body component that I added. And then since this is using physics, instead of using private void update, which is usually how many frames per second, it's recommended by Unity to instead, when you're doing updates by physics, to use fixed update. So in the fixed update function, I just read the input for the horizontal axis, and I read the input for the vertical axis. And then in the horizontal axis, I use that to apply to the X. See, it's like the left and the right. And what I did was I turned the cube on the up axis, this Y axis, and I just turned it to turn left or right. And that's right here. So the speed that I turn when I'm pressing the left or the right arrow, that's a speed that a user can input. And then X is the value from the horizontal axis. And this is the value from -1 to 1. So that just multiplies the -1 to 1 by a turn speed. So, I'm turning faster than one thing at a time. And then you always multiply by time delta time, so things stay at the same speed. And that does the turning over here. That just does the turning. And then there is the Z that I read to be the vertical axis. And as you can see, Z here is like forward and backward. And when I press on the up arrow, I move forward. And I press on the back arrow, I move backward. Okay, so you combine that with the turning, and you kind of got like this movement I could control, smooth movement. So, I took the vertical axis, which once again, the input always gives values from -1 to 1. So it could be either a solid -1 or any decimal in between all the way to 1. And what I do here is I add the relative force. I add a relative force to the rigid body, and I add it to the forward direction times whatever this -1 to 1 is, times the acceleration, so it's greater than just 1. And there's types of force mode that you could add. So I added force mode dot velocity change because it doesn't pay attention to the mass of the rigid body. So I could apply whatever force it is, and it doesn't matter if the cube has a mass that's very light or very heavy, it just applies that force. But there's other ones here, impulse, force, and acceleration. And you can play around with them and see what they look like. But anyway, when I did this tutorial, I started thinking to myself, hey man, this looks like a car moving around. And then that's where I got the idea to take this idea a little further and make a car game. And it looks like the drifting and everything could be really cool.